Shaq was about to enjoy a quiet afternoon until he heard the laughter. Cruel, mocking. Across the street, a black man in a suit was pinned against a police car, his hands cuffed. His crime? Looking suspicious. Papers and a stethoscope spilled from his briefcase. He was a doctor. The officer chuckled. A doctor? That's a good one. The crowd watched, some whispering, others recording, but no one acted. Then Shaq stepped forward. What happened next would destroy a corrupt cop's career, turn the entire city upside down, and spark a movement no one saw coming. Stay till the end, because this story will change the way you see justice. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq had barely shut his car door when he heard it. Sharp, mocking laughter cutting through the midday air. His steps slowed. His eyes flicked toward the noise. Across the street near a police cruiser, a black man in a sharp navy blue business suit was pinned against the hood of the car, his cheek pressed against the metal. Officer Grayson, a tall, broad-shouldered white cop with a smirk stretched across his face, stood over him, gripping his wrist with unnecessary force. Oh, really? A doctor? That's a good one. His laughter was cold, dripping with mockery. His partner, Officer Reynolds, let out a low chuckle but shifted on his feet, looking a little less amused. Shaq's jaw tightened. The man, who Shaq later learned was Dr. Marcus Hill, struggled to move but didn't resist. His voice was tight but calm. Officer, please. This is a mistake. I work at Mercy Hospital. I was on my way there. Grayson rolled his eyes. Mercy Hospital? That's about as believable as me being an astronaut. Marcus's breathing hitched. His briefcase lay open on the ground, its contents scattered. Medical files, prescription pads, and a stethoscope. A doctor's stethoscope. Shaq's eyes flickered toward the bystanders. People stood frozen, watching, whispering, but no one moved. A woman in a green dress clutched her purse tightly, eyes darting between Marcus and the officers. She pulled out her phone, recording. A teenage boy in a hoodie had his phone out too, capturing everything. Shaq inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. He'd seen this before. Too many times. The way Marcus's chest rose and fell faster, not from guilt, but from the quiet terror of a man who knew exactly how bad this could get. The way Grayson's hand rested on his holster, not because he needed to, but because he could. Marcus swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer, I've done nothing wrong. Grayson's smirk deepened. He leaned in close to Marcus's ear. I decide that. Reynolds shifted again, his face slightly uneasy, but he said nothing. Shaq clenched his fists. His heart pounded. Not with fear, but with something else. Resolve. He took a step forward, then another. He wasn't about to let this slide. Shaq's eyes narrow. He's seen this before, and he's not about to let it slide. Shaq's steps were slow, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. The moment he crossed the street, the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The bystanders noticed him immediately. Some whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the towering figure approaching and the officers at the center of the chaos. Others just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Near the curb, a woman in a floral dress stood with her arms crossed tightly, her phone clutched in one hand. She glanced at Shaq but didn't stop recording. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said, "That cop pulled him over for no reason." Shaq's jaw tensed. He had already guessed that much. Marcus Hill was still pinned against the police cruiser, his suit jacket rumpled from the forceful grip on his arms. His chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths, but there was a tension in his shoulders, the restraint of a man who knew that any wrong move could be twisted against him. Shaq stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "What's the problem, officer?" Officer Grayson barely looked at him, his grip on Marcus unwavering. His smirk didn't fade. "Stay out of this, buddy. This is police business." "Buddy." Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose. He had heard that tone before. Marcus lifted his head slightly, his voice measured but firm. "I told you. I work at Mercy Hospital. I'm a doctor." Grayson chuckled, glancing at his partner, Officer Reynolds, who offered only a half-hearted smirk in return. Something in Reynolds' stance had shifted, subtle, but noticeable. Grayson turned back to Marcus. "Oh yeah. Prove it, Doc." Shaq's gaze flickered downward. Scattered across the pavement, just a few feet away, was all the proof anyone needed. Among the spilled papers and overturned briefcase, a stethoscope lay in plain sight. Without a word, Shaq knelt, his large hands carefully picking up the stethoscope. He turned it over, the cool metal reflecting the afternoon light. Then just as deliberately, he straightened and stepped forward, extending it toward Marcus. I think he already did. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few heads turned. Even Reynolds looked uneasy now, shifting slightly on his feet. But Grayson? His smirk only deepened. His fingers twitched toward his radio. He lifted it to his mouth, voice low and sharp. I got a situation here. Send backup. Shaq's brow lifted slightly. Backup? For what? The tension in the air thickened. Marcus inhaled sharply. The bystanders edged closer, their phones still recording. Shaq didn't flinch. He just watched, waited, calculated, because he had seen this playbook before. Grayson wasn't backing down. He was doubling down. And now, things were about to get interesting. Officer Grayson suddenly grips his radio and mutters something into it, calling for backup. For a moment, Shaq thought Grayson might back down. The truth was right in front of him. The stethoscope, the hospital ID, the murmuring crowd that had started to turn against him. Any reasonable person would have realized they were caught. But instead of admitting his mistake, Grayson doubled down. He let out an exaggerated sigh, as if he were the one being inconvenienced, then tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. All right, enough of this, he said, shaking his head. Then with a smirk creeping across his face, he made his move. This man was resisting arrest. The shift in the crowd was immediate. A woman gasped. Someone else muttered, "That's not what happened." Marcus's head jerked up. His wrists were still bound in cuffs, his back pressed against the police car. His voice was steady but edged with disbelief. Resisting how? I haven't moved. Shaq's brow furrowed. His voice, deep and controlled, cut through the tension. Resisting? He let the word hang in the air. He's in handcuffs, officer. Grayson didn't flinch. He had played this game before. He refused to stop when I ordered him to, Grayson continued, his tone smooth, practiced. Then he reached for something in his bag. Shaq watched Officer Reynolds, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. His jaw tightened as he shifted on his feet, looking between Shaq and Grayson. He leaned in slightly, his voice just loud enough for Grayson to hear. Man, this is getting bad. Shaq caught the hesitation in his tone. Reynolds wasn't completely on board. Grayson, on the other hand, acted like he hadn't heard him at all. And then, Shaq saw it. Grayson's foot nudged Marcus's suitcase, pushing it further under the car. It was a subtle movement, one most wouldn't notice, but Shaq noticed everything. And then, in a voice loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, Grayson made his next move. I saw something suspicious fall out of your bag. He turned to Reynolds, throwing out the words as if they were fact. Might be drugs. The reaction was instant. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. Another whispered, "Oh, hell no." Shaq's chest tightened. He had seen this playbook before. Marcus's face drained of color. His hands flexed against the cuffs, his breathing coming faster now. He knew exactly where this was headed. And so did Shaq. His voice, low and firm, sliced through the noise. You serious right now? But Grayson just smirked. He thought he was in control. Marcus's breathing hitched. The panic was setting in. Shaq felt it too. Except he wasn't scared. He was ready. Marcus starts panicking. He knows where this is headed. Shaq does too. Tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Shaq scanned the crowd. More people had gathered now. Some stood frozen, watching, while others whispered to each other. But one thing was clear. All eyes were on this moment. And more importantly, phones were recording. Officer Grayson didn't seem to care. His smirk deepened, his grip on Marcus unwavering. To him, this was a joke. A game he was used to playing. A routine he had run before. Then his gaze locked onto Shaq. You want to interfere? His voice was casual, almost amused. You'll get arrested too. Shaq didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward. A slow, deliberate step. It was subtle, but it was enough. Shaq, towering at 7 feet 1 inch, cast a shadow over the smirking officer. Grayson hesitated for a fraction of a second, but he didn't step back. Shaq's voice was low, measured, but carried weight. Nah, he said simply. I just want to make sure this goes down the right way. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of them nodded. They understood exactly what he meant. Officer Reynolds, standing slightly behind Grayson, tensed. His eyes flickered to Shaq, then to the recording phones, and finally to his partner. He recognized Shaq now, and he knew this was getting out of control. But Grayson? He was still too drunk on his own authority to notice. He kept his grip tight on Marcus, still acting like he had the upper hand. Marcus, still cuffed, kept his breathing steady, but Shaq saw the tension in his shoulders. Then Shaq's gaze dropped to the ground. Scattered across the pavement, Marcus's belongings were spread out like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. And then, Shaq saw it, a small laminated card reflecting the light. Shaq knelt down, slowly, deliberately. He picked it up. Dr. Marcus Hill, head of neurology, Mercy Hospital. Shaq turned, holding the ID badge high so that everyone could see it. The reaction was immediate. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else muttered, "Oh, hell no." A man near the back shook his head. "That's messed up." Officer Reynolds exhaled sharply. His face had gone stiff. But the real moment? Grayson's smirk faltered, just for a second. But Shaq caught it. He wasn't expecting that. And now, he had nowhere to hide. Grayson's smirk fades. He wasn't expecting that. The sharp screech of tires cut through the thick tension like a blade. A third police car rushed onto the scene, coming to a sudden halt. The crowd instinctively stepped back, their murmurs growing louder. Then the door flung open. Out stepped Officer Jenkins. Older, taller than Grayson, but without the arrogance. He carried himself like a man who had seen it all. Unlike the younger officers, he didn't rush into situations. He studied them. His eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on Shaq, then Marcus, and finally Grayson. Shaq watched Jenkins closely. This guy wasn't going to fall for the same old tricks. Not without asking questions first. But before Jenkins could speak, Grayson jumped in. "Glad you're here, sir," he called, his tone shifting. Less smug now, more calculated. He gestured at Marcus, then flicked his hand toward Shaq. This guy was resisting, and this one, he jabbed a finger at Shaq, is interfering with police business. Shaq didn't move. But Jenkins? He barely looked at Grayson. Instead, he locked eyes with Shaq. And in that instant, Shaq saw the flicker of recognition. Jenkins knew exactly who he was dealing with, but he didn't say it, didn't acknowledge it. He just turned to Marcus, scanning him. The suit, the cuffs, the calm, measured breathing of a man trying to hold himself together. And then Jenkins' eyes landed on what Shaq was still holding up. Dr. Marcus Hill, head of neurology, Mercy Hospital. The crowd stirred. Someone muttered, "Oh, damn." Another person shook their head. "That cop messed up." Jenkins' jaw tightened. Then finally he turned to Grayson. "You sure about that?" Grayson faltered for just a second, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Absolutely," he said quickly. He was acting suspicious. "Reach for something. I had to take control of the situation." Shaq's voice was calm, deep, and heavy. He reached for his ID. Silence. Jenkins exhaled slowly. His gaze shifted to Reynolds, who was visibly uncomfortable now. Shaq saw it. The moment Reynolds started sweating, something wasn't adding up, and Jenkins knew it. Then in a slow, measured voice, Jenkins turned to his female partner. "Run his name." But he wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at Grayson. Jenkins says, "Run his name." But he's not talking about Marcus. He's talking about Grayson. For the first time, Grayson wasn't smirking. The moment Jenkins ordered his name to be run, a shift rippled through the air. Small but undeniable. The female officer standing by the squad car, Officer Diaz, tapped at her tablet, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. Shaq noticed it immediately. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her lips pressed together. Something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. Grayson noticed it too. "What's the holdup?" His voice came out sharper than before, an edge of impatience bleeding through. Officer Diaz didn't look up. She kept scrolling, kept reading. Reynolds took a half step back, his weight shifting uneasily. Shaq's eyes flicked toward him. He wasn't standing with Grayson anymore. He was inching away. Interesting. Jenkins, arms crossed, didn't move. He just watched, waiting, cool, silent, calculating. Grayson's jaw tightened. His usual arrogance was still there. But now, there was something else creeping in. Doubt. "Come on, Diaz," he snapped, his voice straining to sound casual. "Just a simple check, right?" She didn't respond. Then, she froze. Her brows furrowed. Her lips parted slightly as if she was seeing something she wasn't expecting. She looked up directly at Jenkins. "Sir," her voice was quieter now, measured. "You might want to see this." Jenkins pushed off the car and walked over, taking the tablet from her hands. His expression didn't change, but Shaq caught the way his fingers gripped the edges, just a little tighter. A long pause. Then Jenkins tilted his head slightly toward another officer and murmured something low. Too low for Grayson to hear, but Shaq noticed how quickly that officer's posture changed, the shift from passive to alert. Something was definitely wrong. Shaq cleared his throat, loud enough to remind everyone what was still happening. His gaze moved to Marcus, who was still standing stiffly, his wrists bound in metal. Shaq turned to Jenkins, his voice calm but carrying weight. "How about you uncuff the doctor?" Jenkins held Shaq's stare for a moment. Then slowly, he nodded. He looked at Diaz. "Take the cuffs off." The crowd gasped. Marcus's shoulders sagged slightly in relief. "Grayson?" He didn't move, didn't say a word, but his fingers twitched at his side, because he knew he was losing control. Officer Jenkins nods. "Take the cuffs off." A cold silence fell over the scene. Officer Diaz's face had gone pale. Her eyes locked onto the screen of her tablet as if she couldn't believe what she was reading. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the information, her lips pressing into a tight line. Shaq knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how deep it went. But from the look on Diaz's face, this wasn't just a mistake. This was a pattern. Shaq's gaze shifted to Jenkins, whose expression remained unreadable, but his body language said everything. His shoulders had squared. His hands had moved to his belt. Not for his weapon, but in the way a man does when preparing for bad news. He took the tablet from Diaz and scanned the file himself. Then very slowly he exhaled through his nose. Shaq saw his grip tighten around the edges of the device. Something was seriously wrong. Jenkins lifted his head, his jaw clenched. He didn't look at Grayson. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Diaz. "Read it out loud." Grayson stiffened. Shaq caught it, the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his fingers curled slightly at his side. But Diaz obeyed. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the crowd go silent. "Officer Thomas Grayson, 12 complaints of racial profiling, 7 excessive force reports, 4 wrongful arrests, all dismissed." The murmurs from the crowd turned into gasps. Shaq heard someone whisper, "12 complaints?" Another voice muttered, "They let this guy stay on the force?" Marcus let out a sharp breath. His shoulders tensed, but his face remained controlled. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. Shaq exchanged a glance with him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't one bad day. This was who Grayson was. Grayson's jaw was tight, his entire body wired like a man who just realized his free ride was over. And then, the moment broke. Officer Reynolds took a deliberate step back. "I didn't sign up for this, man." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Grayson's head snapped toward him. "What?" Reynolds shook his head, taking another step back, his hands lifting slightly as if distancing himself from a sinking ship. "I knew you had an attitude, man, but this? You set him up." He motioned toward Marcus. "You laughed about it." Shaq noticed the way Grayson's nostrils flared, the way his hands curled into fists. Jenkins was watching him now. Shaq saw it coming before it happened. Jenkins turned, his voice flat and final. "You're done." The crowd murmured louder now. People shifted, watching the moment unfold. Shaq should have felt satisfaction, but something in the air still felt wrong. And then, Grayson moved. But Grayson is not going down quietly. The moment Jenkins said, "You're done," something inside Grayson snapped. His body tensed like a wild animal backed into a corner, realizing there was no escape. A cornered man is the most dangerous kind. The crowd felt it too. Conversations hushed. All eyes were locked onto him. Shaq didn't blink. He had seen this before. The moment when arrogance mutates into desperation. And Grayson? He was unraveling fast. His chest rose and fell sharply. His fingers twitched at his belt. Then, in one sudden movement, he lunged. His hand shot toward his taser. Not at Shaq, not at Jenkins. At Marcus. There was a sharp gasp from the crowd. A second stretched into eternity. The flicker of electricity from the taser sparked, but it never reached its target. Because Shaq moved first, faster than anyone expected for a man his size. His massive hand clamped around Grayson's wrist midair, stopping him cold. The force was immediate. Grayson's arm jerked to a halt like it had hit a steel beam. His eyes went wide. Shock replaced rage. The crowd exploded. "Oh, hell no!" someone shouted. A woman gasped. "Did you see that?" Shaq's grip tightened. Not enough to hurt, just enough to send a message. Enough to say, "This stops now." Grayson struggled, his breath ragged. His ego wouldn't let him accept what just happened. But Shaq wasn't letting go. Not yet. "That's assault, officer." His voice was calm, cold, unshakable. Jenkins was already stepping in, his voice sharp. "Stand down, officer." Reynolds didn't move, didn't even try to defend his partner. His hands were up, like he didn't want to be anywhere near this mess. The taser slipped from Grayson's grip, clattering to the ground. Shaq finally let go. Grayson stumbled back, clutching his wrist. His face burned. Red not just with anger, but humiliation. Then the sound of handcuffs clicking broke through the chaos. Not for Marcus, not for Shaq, for Grayson. Grayson's face goes red, because now he's the one being put in cuffs. For once, the system worked the way it should. The crisp click of handcuffs locking around Grayson's wrists echoed through the street, silencing the stunned crowd for just a moment before it erupted. Cheers, applause, disbelief. People raised their phones higher, capturing a moment they never thought they'd see. A corrupt cop, finally facing consequences. Grayson stiffened as Officer Jenkins yanked his arms behind his back. His jaw clenched so tight his cheek twitched. This wasn't how his day was supposed to go. Not like this. He had gotten away with it so many times before. Too many times. But now the badge wasn't protecting him anymore. The irony wasn't lost on Shaq. Just minutes ago, Marcus was in cuffs, humiliated for simply existing. Now, his arresting officer was the one being shoved into the back of a squad car. Grayson struggled, his voice sharp, desperate. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me. I was doing my job." Jenkins slammed the car door shut, hard. Then for the first time, he turned to face Shaq directly. No arrogance, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding. "He's done." Shaq's expression didn't change. He wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He turned slightly, his eyes locking on to the dozens of faces in the crowd. Faces that had seen this kind of injustice before. Some were smiling, hopeful. Others, skeptical, because they'd seen bad cops go down before, and they'd seen how nothing ever really changed. Marcus let out a slow breath, rubbing his wrist where the cuffs had been. His suit was wrinkled, his dignity bruised, but his voice was steady. That guy had 12 complaints. His tone wasn't angry, just exhausted. And he still had a badge. You know how often that happens? Jenkins hesitated, his fingers flexing at his side. Shaq took a step forward, his voice calm but heavy. "This happens way too often." Jenkins didn't look away, didn't try to argue. Shaq tilted his head. "What's going to change?" Jenkins let the question hang in the air for a second. Then he gave a slow, firm nod. "I think you just started something." Shaq inhaled deeply, his mind already racing. Because Jenkins was right. This couldn't be just another viral video. It had to mean something. And in that moment, Shaq had an idea. A big one. Shaq has an idea. A big one. Shaq sat in a conference room far from the chaos of the street, but the tension in the air was just as thick. Across from him sat 3 city officials, a police commissioner, and a press liaison. Their expressions were neutral, polished, practiced, but Shaq saw through it. They weren't here because they wanted change. They were here because they had no choice. Because the world was watching. He placed his phone on the table, tapping the screen once. The viral video of Grayson's arrest was still climbing past 1 million views. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "This can't just be another headline that fades in a week. We need real change." The commissioner sighed, adjusting his tie. "We understand your frustration, Mr. O'Neill, but—" Shaq cut him off. "Number you don't." The silence that followed was heavy. Shaq glanced at Marcus, sitting beside him. The doctor had handled himself with grace through the whole ordeal, but Shaq could see the exhaustion in his eyes. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about every time it happened before. Every time it would happen again if nothing changed. The press liaison cleared her throat. "The department is already working on a statement. We will issue a public apology to Dr. Hill and review the officer's conduct." Shaq shook his head. "That's not enough." Marcus finally spoke, his voice controlled but firm. What about the 12 complaints Grayson had before this? If no one had filmed today, he'd still have a badge. The commissioner's jaw tightened. He had no answer for that. Shaq let the weight of that truth settle. Then he dropped the real challenge. Body cameras, department-wide, no exceptions. You need public oversight on complaints like this. If an officer abuses their power, there should be no misunderstandings. The room shifted. That got their attention. One official adjusted his glasses. That's a major funding issue. Shaq leaned back. I'll fund it. Silence. Eyes widened. The commissioner blinked. You're serious? Shaq folded his arms. I don't play around when it comes to accountability. The officials exchanged looks. This wasn't just a celebrity calling for change. Shaq was putting his money where his mouth was, and now they had no excuses. Meanwhile, Marcus was making headlines. News outlets picked up his story, calling him the doctor who stood tall. A hospital executive saw his interview and called him directly. They offered him a promotion, head of emergency medicine. For once, justice had ripple effects. Shaq watched Marcus take the call, a proud smile crossing his face. Good. He deserved it. Then, Shaq's phone buzzed. A new message. From the mayor himself. Shaq's phone buzzes. It's an invitation from the mayor. Shaq stared at his phone, the message glowing on the screen. Mayor Daniels would like to meet. 10 a.m. City Hall. It didn't surprise him. Moments like these didn't just go viral. They forced the right people to act. But Shaq wasn't interested in symbolic gestures or empty words. If the mayor wanted a conversation, it had to mean something. So the next morning, he walked into City Hall with a plan. The conference room was polished and pristine, a place where decisions were made but not always followed through. Mayor Daniels sat at the head of the table, flanked by his advisors, the police commissioner, and the city's chief legal counsel. The mood was formal, but Shaq, he wasn't here to play politics. He sat across from the mayor, his massive frame making the leather chair seem too small. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Daniel smiled, but it was the kind of smile politicians wore when cameras were rolling. Shaquille, the mayor began, folding his hands together. First off, let me say we appreciate your involvement. What happened to Dr. Hill never should have occurred. Shaq nodded, leaning forward slightly. Glad you feel that way. His voice was calm but firm. So what are we doing about it? A beat of silence. The commissioner cleared his throat. Officer Grayson has been formally terminated. His record will be reviewed for any possible criminal charges. Shaq didn't blink. That's a start. Daniel shifted in his seat. We also want to assure the public that we take these matters seriously. We're launching a full review of past misconduct complaints within the department. Shaq could hear the polished, rehearsed tone. It wasn't enough. He glanced at Marcus, who had joined him at the meeting. The doctor looked composed, but Shaq could see the exhaustion in his eyes. How many people like Marcus had been through the same thing, without a camera to save them? Shaq turned back to the mayor. It was time to push harder. That's not enough, he said plainly. The advisors stiffened slightly. The commissioner shifted in his seat. Daniels forced another smile. What do you propose? Shaq pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. A body camera program, department-wide, no exceptions. The legal counsel blinked in surprise. That's an expensive initiative. Shaq shrugged. I'm paying for it. Silence. Real silence. The mayor's advisors exchanged glances. The commissioner adjusted his tie. Even Daniels looked caught off guard. Shaq leaned back, folding his arms. Money's not the issue. The question is, do you actually want this? The mayor exhaled, considering him. Then slowly he nodded. All right, Daniel said. Let's make it happen. By noon, the press release went live. In partnership with Shaquille O'Neal, the city will be launching a district-wide body camera initiative to ensure police accountability. The internet exploded. Headlines ran the story immediately. Shaq funds body cameras for entire police force, demanding real change. From NBA legend to activist, Shaq takes a stand. This can't be another viral moment. O'Neal's push for reform. The response was instant. Some called him a hero. Some said he was overstepping. But one thing was clear. Change was happening. Shaq sat back in his car, scrolling through the reactions. And then his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. Mr. O'Neal? The voice was sharp. Director. This is District Attorney Wallace. We need to talk about Officer Grayson. And as for Officer Grayson, he's just about to get a taste of real justice. The courtroom was silent. Tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the man standing before her. Former officer Thomas Grayson, the man who once smirked as he pinned an innocent black doctor against a police car. Now, he looked nothing like the arrogant cop who mocked Marcus that day. His uniform was gone, replaced by a stiff gray suit that did nothing to hide the sweat gathering at his temple. His hands, once so quick to reach for his taser, were now clenched behind his back. And his smirk, long gone. The judge cleared her throat. The entire city was watching. Reporters lined the benches. News cameras flickered. This wasn't just another trial. This was a message. Shaq sat in the front row, arms crossed, his massive presence impossible to ignore. Beside him, Marcus sat tall, composed, but Shaq could feel the weight of this moment pressing on him. For too long, men like Grayson walked free, but not today. The judge spoke, her voice firm, echoing through the packed room. After reviewing all evidence, including Officer Grayson's documented history of misconduct, this court finds the defendant, pause, a breath. The courtroom seemed to inhale all at once. Guilty. The room exhaled, a collective release of air, of tension, of disbelief that this time, finally, justice had been served. Grayson's shoulders sagged. His lawyer muttered something, but it didn't matter. It was over. Shaq's fingers tightened against his armrest. This was the ending Grayson earned. The judge's voice carried on, delivering the final blow. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 5 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. Shaq heard a muffled gasp from the back of the courtroom. The system wasn't perfect, but today it worked. Grayson was escorted out, his wrists locked in cuffs, the same way he once restrained Marcus for simply existing. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. He watched until the courtroom doors shut behind him. Then he turned to Marcus. The doctor let out a slow breath. Not relief, not victory, just a quiet, settled acceptance. Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You good, Doc?" Marcus nodded, smiling for the first time that day. "Guess I owe you a free checkup." Shaq chuckled, standing. "Nah, man, just keep saving lives." They walked out together, stepping into the fresh air, two men who refused to stay silent. And that's how one moment of injustice turned into a movement for real change.